Welcome back, everybody. So today we are going to be going over the inner workings of the economy from a United States perspective, the United Kingdom perspective, and we are probably going to be touching on some things what are probably going to be a little bit sensitive, but I just really want to address a lot of these underlying economic and financial issues what are going on in the economy. I have a lot of friends who do not understand what is currently going on, and it's incredibly frustrating because they are basically listening to people who are basically advocating for more government control and more intervention from the same people who caused the problem for the solution. And I don't think that is the best way of going about it. And you know, we have people like Gary Economics and Jimmy the Giant who are basically aligning with specific demographics, and these demographics are basically advocating for more government intervention, and I think it's a very slippery slope, and I don't think it's very good for business, and I think it's definitely not good for people in the economy. And yeah, I want to kind of show you the incentive, and I can basically show you the outcome of why these people who are basically pushing for these policies are significantly pushed, because it basically reaffirms the current system. So if you enjoyed the video, please like, comment and subscribe. I do reply to every single comment. I would massively encourage for you to leave a comment, because that is where the debate pretty much happens. I do struggle a little bit in terms of presenting, because I have a lot of things going on in my head, and you know, I don't really have that much time in terms of preparing. So you know, please just be gentle. But anyway, let's get into the rest of the video. So basically, this is a holistic overview of the current state of the economy. Now, I am aware that I'm probably missing a few different pieces inside this puzzle, and you know, I'm also aware as well that we can pretty much go into detail in each specific section, very detailed, and do 20 videos on blah 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 blah. But if I'm being completely honest, I do not have the time to go into that level of detail, so I really want to just give you a snapshot and a holistic overview of currently what is going on and why the current system is broken in the United States and in the UK, and why the UK has a significant amount of problems. And I really want to basically just highlight to you of why you feel so broken about, well, so broken with the system, and probably why you feel incredibly poor, and why everyone seems to be doing exceptionally well, especially on Instagram and all the rest of it. So anyway, basically, in the foundation of the economy, we basically have the money. Now, inside the economy, we basically have the employees, businesses, politicians, and the government. Now, in the employees, you can basically say that we have like consumers who obviously consume. Like, everybody's basically a consumer inside the economy. You are buying goods and services from the businesses inside the economy. Now, I want to touch on the government's involvement inside the economy. Now, what we basically have is the government basically obviously raises revenue by taxation, what basically pays for public services. You don't need me to go into the ins and outs of public services like the NHS, the healthcare system, roads, etc., police, blah 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 blah. Now, as the demand, on the demand side, especially when it comes to economics, you always have supply and demand. So you want to, let's say, increase more demand for public services, what would allow you to basically raise taxes, or you have the justification of raising taxes. And also, as well, you have the justification in terms of printing more money. So it's very good that you have a lot of stress on public services if you are a government, because you can basically print more money to basically fund these services. And you know, the demand side of things would probably come from, let's say probably, they definitely come from demographics. Specifically, let's say older demographics. So as more and more people get older, they are more and more reliant on the system, because obviously healthcare needs, etc. Obviously, there's another debate around immigration and a few other different things, what I'm not really going to touch on for obvious reasons, because it is very polarizing, but you can kind of make your own assumptions there of why you would want more and more demand for public services. Now, I want to touch on the media. So the media, I would always typically look at the media as the advertisement arm for legislation or policy from a politician or from a government perspective. And they're typically highlighting problems inside the economy, what typically drives emotion, and that emotion typically drives action, and that action typically drives legislation and ultimately policy, what typically advocates for more, let's say, taxation on the rich, or more legislation for large businesses or small businesses or whatever. Now, legislation and policy can be exceptionally good, specifically when it comes to large multinationals, because it basically squeezes out your competitors. So normally, large multinationals love legislation because it suffocates the competition. Now, when you start to look at innovation, and where majority of innovation takes place, when you look at the people, or let's say countries, who have the largest amounts of legislation, you don't really see much innovation or technology or whatever you want to call it to come out of them countries. So let's just take tech companies, for example, or like majority of tech businesses are founded in the United States. They are typically not founded in Europe. I mean, name me some great tech businesses what have come out of Europe in the last 20 to 30 years. It's very difficult to kind of pinpoint specifics. I mean, I know you have like Wise, Revolut, kind of like fintech businesses, right? Spotify, etc. But when you start to really delve deep, there's a lot of legislation in Europe compared to the United States, and obviously that's why you typically have more innovation in places what typically has less legislation. But anyway, so let's talk about the large multinationals. So when it comes to public services, when public services have a lot of, let's say, stress, so as public services become more and more stressed, they typically require more help from the private sector. So you'd put out, let's say, contracts or grants or whatever, and these government grants are basically, the people who typically win them are normally large multinational corporations, because these corporations typically have the infrastructure, they obviously meet all the legislations in terms of accreditation, blah, 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 blah. And don't get me wrong, accreditations and legislation can be quite good. I'm not necessarily saying that all legislation is bad, but what I'm basically getting at is that the vast majority of people cannot necessarily get access to these contracts because there is a lot of, let's say, hoops you need to jump through to basically get these contracts. So as the cash comes over to the large multi organization, these organizations typically have offshore entities, and these entities are typically set up in different types of jurisdictions around the world, such as the Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey, Bermuda, etc. Now, a lot of these countries are aligned with the United States, well, not with the United States, with the United Kingdom. So what typically happens is, as the money obviously comes to that large multinational, let's say in the UK or in the US, then that money is typically pushed to a offshore company. We are not going to get into the inner workings of tax and how these companies are typically set up, but typically you have a offshore company what holds, let's say, a trademark or specific intellectual property, and that company is basically charging the company in the UK or in the US for, let's say, rights to use that logo. And yeah, that is typically how the money is moved out of the country to another jurisdiction. Now, a lot of people, rightly so, and get quite angry by that. And I fully understand it, why you would get very angry. But yeah, I'm just kind of obviously explaining the rules of the game, and if you understand the rules of the game, you can basically play by them rules. Now, what you need to be aware of, and this is something what a lot of people really forget, is that a lot of these large multinationals, these large corporations, have a significant amount of shareholders. Now, the shareholders, you basically have shareholders for all businesses. So the large businesses, inside them shareholders, you have a lot of pensions, who are basically funding people's retirements, who are basically a lot of these employees. So let's say you have people who basically advocate for Jeff Bezos or Elon or whoever to basically not have as much wealth. So as their businesses do exceptionally well, by obviously providing a good product and service, their share value obviously increases, and as a result, their net worth increases. Also, as well, the reason why the share prices can increase is due to currency debasement, what we will be touching on later. But basically, what I'm basically getting at is for, let's say, Elon to give away a lot of his wealth, he would have to sell a lot of them shares, and obviously somebody would have to buy them shares. Now, if Elon is then, let's say, forced to sell 400 billion of Tesla shares, what do you think happens to the Tesla shares stock? And what do you think happens to the S&P 500? What do you think happens to NASDAQ? And most importantly, what do you think happens to your pension? So there's a lot of, let's say, financial plumbing in all of this system, and it is very, very opaque, and it's very can be very, very complicated, and it's complicated by design, because again, it's supposed to be like that, because again, majority of people are told not to look up and not necessarily dive into the inner workings of the entire system. So there's a lot of complexity. Now, what I would say is that, let's say, on the top 5%, 10%, 1%, or whatever, they normally do not sell assets, because assets go up in value in relation to the currency supply in terms of being debased. So they typically hold onto assets, and they get finance against them assets. So the underlying asset appreciates, and the debt gets eroded away, because obviously as they print more and more money, the debt servicing cost becomes easier and easier, obviously, as the asset goes up. So this is the reason why the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, is because wealthy people own assets and poor people do not own assets. So, for example, the reason why Elon can buy Twitter is because he takes a loan out against his Tesla shares, and he can buy Twitter with debt, not necessarily just hard cash, because the hard cash would get taxed. Now, when you refinance and when you, let's say, pull money out as debt, there is no taxation on debt. So again, a lot of people are not necessarily aware of a lot of these inner workings when it comes to, let's say, the top 1% or the people who run very, very large businesses. And also as well, they are typically set up in different types of jurisdictions when it comes to trusts and all the rest of it. So again, there's a lot of complexity when it comes to large multinationals and all the rest of it. But obviously the debate is all held here, because the people who run businesses and the people who, God forbid, make a profit, are really in the spotlight, especially when it comes to taxation, not paying taxes, blah 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 blah, when we do not even pay attention to the accountability of the government. And this is one thing what I really want to reiterate, is that if you run a business, or if you run a very, very large organization, there is accountability in terms of performance, and you are subject to performance benefits. So let's just touch on Elon again. Like, Elon was rewarded share compensation if he hit specific milestones in the business, and the shareholders basically voted for that. Is that if you got the business to a certain level of revenue and you made a certain amount of money, we would reward you in terms of share compensation for obviously hitting the milestones. So you are rewarded as a result of your hard work. Now, this goes through all different types of businesses. So obviously, if you are a shareholder, you have a voting rights in the business. So you can basically change the management, you can basically change the CEO and all the rest of it. And again, we can get into the inner workings of how share structures and how voting rights all basically work. But when it comes to the government, there is no accountability. So obviously, if you overspend, like, whoopsie-doo, who cares? I mean, really, who really does care? Because again, if you have a democracy, typically the party who overspends or puts the country in a difficult position obviously would typically get switched out to another party. But obviously, if they're all singing from the same hymn sheet by basically printing more money or advocating for more government debt, you basically don't have a democracy. So you are always going to be stuck in this cycle. And, that is currently where we see ourselves in. Now, like I was saying to you before, the government has the ability to basically print the money, and when they print the money, it distorts asset prices. And it's not just one asset prices; it's the entire stack. It's absolutely everything inside the economy looks like it's going up in value, but obviously the vast majority of people are getting a fixed salary, and that fixed salary is as a result of the businesses. Now, going back to businesses, some of these businesses cannot necessarily have competitive advantages when it comes to pricing or economics of scale. So some of these businesses cannot increase wages, what obviously puts a significant stress on small to medium-sized businesses and employees. And, there's a lot of issues when it comes to small businesses and, You know, a lot of these small businesses do not want to get taxed because it is very, very difficult to be a small business. And, you know, I've got a lot of friends who are struggling at the moment, and a lot of, not necessarily friends who run businesses, but even just people who are on payroll and all the rest of it, they are massively, massively struggling. And they think that a lot of it is to do with the rich who are over here. They think it's to do with Jeff Bezos and all the rest of it. And the thing is, even though, again, they do play a specific role, right? But the vast majority of the issue is coming from government intervention in terms of printing money. And this is distorting absolutely everything. Like, this is the reason why I'm a massive advocate in terms of sound money. Because we really want to be going back to hard money principles, because you are forced to be disciplined. It forces the discipline. Because, let's say, I mean, it's like an alcoholic, right? It's like, when you are an alcoholic, I'm not saying that I am an alcoholic, but you get what I'm saying. It's like, you're an alcoholic. You are constantly addicted to the booze. You can't stop drinking. And it's very much the same with the government. The government cannot stop spending. And there's a lot of, let's say, incentive to make these public services significantly under a lot of stress by increasing the demand. Like, this is the whole thing what I find very fascinating. I was thinking about this when I was walking the other day, is that the government does not shrink. It constantly keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And these problems, these public services problems, keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And again, how do you create them? How do you make them bigger and bigger? You basically increase the demand. And I think this is the reason why we see a lot of immigration, is because it creates this demand, what ultimately creates the funding, what ultimately creates the contracts, what ultimately pushes it to large organizations, companies, etc., what ultimately pushes it all offshore. And then obviously you have more concentration of wealth globally, and the countries are basically suffocating because they do not have the capital to basically fund industry, especially the small to medium-sized businesses over here. So when you have this concentration, in terms of there's only a certain amount of entities who are currently controlling the vast majority of companies, multinationals, etc., you don't really have a open free market. You don't really have capitalism. You are basically advocating for more and more socialism. And going back to the media side of things, I think this is the reason why, let's say, people like Gary Economics and Jimmy the Giant are basically large advocates in terms of taxing the rich over here, because it makes people look over here. It makes people blame Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, blah, 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 blah. And it does not necessarily look at the printing of money, what massively, massively distorts all asset prices. Now, what I want to talk about is something here, what is in relation to class dynamics. And this is just going over just the different types of categories inside the economy, how we have the lower class, the middle class, the upper class, and the politically connected. Now, obviously, lower class and middle class, they are typically working on hourly wages and obviously fixed salaries. So the income stability from the low to middle class. Now, the income stability is low to moderate, basically meaning that obviously you have automation and AI, what is basically eating a lot of these jobs from a lower class perspective, obviously a middle class perspective. The asset ownership is very, very little, especially when it comes to lower class. Middle class, typically the biggest asset, what they typically own, is their home, and obviously they do have a few limited investments. Now, the tax burdens, this is something what I think a lot of people don't really pay attention to, because people basically say, well, the lower class is not necessarily taxed as heavily, whereas I think that they actually are. Obviously, they have sales tax, they have fuel tax, and they also have something called sin taxes. Now, some I'm not saying all people, but the vast majority of people who are, let's say, lower class or middle class, typically, let's say, smoke cigarettes. They're a big advocate for gambling or lottery tickets or alcohol, etc., fast food, and all the rest of it. Now, these, let's say, activities are very, very heavily taxed. So I am aware that obviously there is upper class and politically connected who obviously are boozing and smoking and all the rest of it, but I can pretty much guarantee that they are not necessarily buying lottery tickets. But again, these areas of the society, in my opinion, are taxation or tax burdens on the low class and obviously middle class, because that's their way to have fun, right? But on obviously the outcome trend, obviously you have shrinking real income, and obviously lifestyle taxes obviously deepen them more into poverty, because obviously as the money starts to get debased, a lot of these goods and services cost more and more money, and typically they are on fixed hourly wages. Typically with large multinationals, obviously if you are working at Tesco, or if you're working at Walmart or whatever, your hourly wages are probably not going to go up at the same rate as inflation, so you are probably going to feel more and more squeezed. Now, when it comes to the upper class and politically connected, obviously the upper class, you probably have, let's say, ultra wealthy as well, somewhere in here, but obviously the primary income type for the upper class is the investments and asset yields. So they might let's say, own a multitude of different businesses. They might have different types of, let's say, assets when it comes to property, etc. The income stability is relatively high because they own the vast majority of their income is in assets. The asset ownership is diversified and significant, so they might have different types of assets in different types of jurisdictions. They might have assets or businesses in the United States, in Singapore, in Dubai, whatever. The tax burden normally is capital gains and luxury taxes, but obviously these can be, let's say, offset if they are set up correctly. Now, the outcome of all of this is mainly just, let's say, regulation creep. So obviously more and more people are advocating for more taxation, more higher corporation tax, or advocating for citizenship removal, or whatever you want to call it. And this is the reason why, like typically the rich like to be very mobile when it comes to moving to different jurisdictions to obviously make sure that they are mitigating a lot of their tax burden. But again, I mean, it's very, very dependent on the industry, what they are normally operating in, and obviously their citizenship. But again, I mean, we are obviously talking about people who are worth well in excess of $1 billion or £1 billion. Now, they're politically connected. Their primary income source is obviously government contracts and subsidies. Obviously, as you can pretty much imagine, the income stability is pretty much guaranteed. They're guaranteed that income. The asset ownership is pretty much extensive. The tax advantages is like subsidies, contracts, discretionary exemptions. Obviously, if you are going on a business trip and you can put a lot of things, let's say, through the government or whatever, because they are always going to pay for things. And obviously the outcome is wealth protection via influence and asset inflation benefits. So again, as you, let's say, acquire all of these assets, if you start to print more and more money, obviously your assets will go up over time. And obviously as well, you can be a very, very, very large advocate in terms of wealth protection. Now, something else to be aware of is a lot of people who are in the upper class, so let's say the top 1% who are owning a lot of offshore entities. A lot of their investments are typically made back to politicians in relation to wealth protection and asset inflation. So again, there's incentives to obviously pass money from these offshore entities back to politicians who basically advocate for more legislation, what makes these businesses more and more valuable, and most importantly as well, obviously, as the politicians basically advocate for more wealth protection, obviously everybody becomes more and more wealthier, apart from employees, or let's say the lower class, middle class. I mean, middle class does get a little bit of a boost through assets such as their home and minimal investments. But again, this whole system is very, very designed in terms of wealth protection. And we are, in my opinion, I think we are looking at the wrong people in terms of blaming the wrong people, should I say, when we really should be blaming the accountability of government spending, not necessarily the people who are running businesses and obviously who get rewarded as a result of making a very, very, very good business. Because obviously there is people who make a very good business. They risk a lot of their capital, their time. That business does exceptionally well. You don't really want to remove the incentive away from doing good work or creating a good business, because when you start to remove the incentive, it's like why even do it if you are not necessarily going to make a lot of money as a result. Some people are typically, let's say not everybody, but there's a lot of people who are motivated by money. So yeah, why would you do it? So what I want to also reiterate is the importance of currency debasement, because what I'm basically talking about is how governments basically intervene and print money. Now, when they intervene and print money, what you basically see is that all asset prices basically increase. So let's say we have a village. So we have a village here, and there's, let's say, 100 coins in the village, and year one, a loaf of bread was 0.05, let's say, cents. Jug of milk, chicken, let's say a simple house is 5 coins in a village. And throughout the years, we print more and more money, or more coins in circulation. And what does that do to the price of these goods and services? Now, there will be certain things in the economy, let's say jugs of milk or chicken, what will do, let's say, relatively okay. And the reason why they will do relatively okay, again, is because it's due to supply and demand. So when it comes to housing, you are not necessarily adding more supply of housing onto the open market over and over and over again, because it's limited by the land, by the supply, there's supply constraints and all the rest of it. But when it comes to chicken and when it comes to jugs of milk, you can basically increase the supply of chicken and obviously increase the supply of milk. What would suppress the price of milk and chicken, obviously, throughout the years. So as you can see here, the change in terms of percentage change is very, very different, because obviously you have more supply coming online, what basically makes the price be more and more compressed. But again, this is just in a very simple example, but you can basically see as the coinage in circulation enters into the village, the things in the village go up in value. But this is just a very simple example how you can basically see as the coins entered into the village, we see some of the goods and services basically go up as a result of the supply and demand dynamics of these specific goods and services. So specifically when it comes to housing, typically you always see housing be very, very limited in supply, and obviously that has a squeeze on the underlying price, obviously as the coins go up in the village. And this is just something what I just thought I just kind of throw together just to kind of highlight how you have supply and demand constraints on the economy, what ultimately drives the prices up. Now, on the housing side of things, especially when it comes to the UK, a lot of people are basically advocating for more and more housing. But obviously, as you can probably imagine, there's a lot of legislation around housing. And, that obviously has a large squeeze on the assets. So, the vast majority of people put their money into property in the UK. And this is not necessarily just in the UK, but this is globally. A lot of people put their money into the UK because of the property market. The property market is probably one of the only things left in the UK what has a significant amount of value. So again, just increasing the supply of housing is probably going to be a little bit tricky. And this is probably the reason why we see large trends around HMOs. HMOs, if you are American or Canadian or whatever, HMOs are basically homes of multiple occupancy, and people are basically converting small houses into even smaller houses to basically squeeze more and more yield out. And this is another thing, just going back to this whole supply dynamic. Where do you think the supply comes, or the demand comes, from these HMOs? And how do you think they get funded? These small to medium-sized businesses, they are basically just doing contracts to housing associations. But again, who pays the housing associations? Okay, well, how does that all get funded? Okay. So this whole thing is massively broken because the foundation is broken. This over here is significantly broken. This was gold, where it was very, very difficult to obviously print more gold because you obviously had to extract it. It took you time and energy to basically extract it, whereas now you basically just print the money. And going back to the whole HMO thing, you want to, rather than building houses, it's easier just to convert the HMOs, pay the housing associations through public services or through different types of contracts, what ultimately pays some of these small to medium-sized businesses. And you can create more and more demand through immigration or through whatever. And the whole system, you can basically kick the can down the road. But I think this is probably going to come to some type of end sooner or later. Now, what I also just wanted to touch on, what I found quite interesting, is just the breakup between millionaires and billionaires by country. So the vast majority of billionaires is in the United States. This would not be a surprise. And, China has about 450, Japan 50, United Kingdom about 150 billionaires, mainly in the financial sector and legacy wealth. And this is the whole thing as well. Like, what I think a lot of people really misunderstand is that you want people with money in your country because they are going to be consuming and they're going to be buying things what the vast majority of people are not going to be buying, because having wealthy people about is going to be good for small to medium-sized businesses because they are going to be consuming. They are not going to always hoard their wealth. They need to do things with it. And this is the whole thing what I was putting here as well. Like a lot of the money what is in these offshore entities, they have to make investments, and these investments have to go back to other different types of jurisdictions. What obviously have let's say more favourable. They don't necessarily have to have more favourable business environments, but obviously if your country has favourable business environments, you are going to see a lot of investment flow to that country, because obviously you can get a better return of capital inside that country than if you went to another different types of jurisdiction. So again, this is the whole idea of not necessarily pushing wealth away, rather than welcoming wealth back into the country, because if you lean into innovation like fintech, like AI and all the rest of it. I know I've done multiple videos on all these different types of subjects, but I just don't understand why they would be advocating for more and more government spending, because it basically breaks the entire system. And ultimately, I think it only leads to socialism. And I think that's a very, very scary thing, because a lot of these businesses, it's going to be very, very difficult to basically get out of it. And I know I posted something out on my Instagram page called DC Economics, basically talking about Marxism, about how a lot of these policies, what a lot of these YouTubers are basically advocating for is more government intervention. We are probably leaning more and more towards that. So yeah, I just think it's very, very interesting to pay attention to. And also as well, what I thought was interesting to do is that obviously on the money side of things, so obviously the government prints more money, but they are basically printing more money from the Bank of England. And the Bank of England is obviously one of the central banks around the world, like prominent central banks around the world. But the Fed, obviously in the United States, the most powerful central bank in the world, and obviously has the reserve status. Now, what is also interesting is that they are all part of a big boys club, what none of us are in, called the Bank of International Settlements. And this is basically a group, and they basically dictate monetary and fiscal policy globally. They kind of all sit together and basically talk about what they're going to be doing from a monetary perspective and all the rest of it. I'm not going to get into this in this video, but I just wanted to highlight there's a lot of complexity to this entire thing. And, we are all keep getting told that taxing the rich and, creating problems for small to medium-sized businesses, not necessarily problems, but just putting more and more stress on small to medium-sized businesses, what ultimately puts more stress on, do you mean just the general workforce in terms of labour, in terms of employees and all the rest of it. We do not necessarily hold the government to account in terms of what they are currently spending their money on. And, this entire area over here is very, very, very opaque, and it's opaque by design. And obviously what we hear in the media in relation to public services and how we need to raise more money and raise more taxes and blah 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 blah. Again, that puts more accountability on businesses and obviously large multinationals as well. But again, they have the privilege of basically offshoring a lot of that capital. Whereas, obviously, the government, nobody basically says, hang on a minute, what are we currently spending money on? Where's that money currently going? Do we really need that? Do we really need this? A, B, C, X, Y, and Z. And, I know we saw that a lot of movement with Doge and Elon. And, I don't really know where all of this is probably going to go. But yeah, I just want to highlight and show to you guys a different perspective on the inner workings of the economy. Obviously, if you think I've got anything wrong, please let me know. I am probably going to watch this video back and probably think, wow, I should have really mentioned this, I really should have mentioned that. But hopefully you've enjoyed the content. And another thing what I really wanted to reiterate is employees. Obviously there's more people who are employees than business owners, and obviously more business owners than politicians, and obviously more politicians than one specific government. But what I found very, very interesting is this quote is like, give them bread and circuses and they will never revolt. And, like back in the day in Rome, it was all about the Colosseum, gladiators, etc. And obviously in England, if you are from England or you're from the United States, obviously basketball, baseball, and etc. Music, culture, Netflix, it's all about sedating. Sedating is probably a bit too aggressive. But basically what I'm getting at is that a lot of people don't even think about their money. They don't even understand or question what is money, the principles of what money is. They're too busy, obviously, arguing over football, over baseball, scrolling TikTok, scrolling Instagram, doing whatever, rather than thinking deeper. And the whole idea of me doing these videos is I really want people to think deeper and really understand what is currently going on in the current system, because we are all told on what to think, not how to think. And obviously having the ability to think, I think, is very, 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 very important, and it will give you a massive advantage, especially when it comes to investments, because if you can kind of understand how the system is currently working, obviously you can basically position yourself in certain situations where you can basically do exceptionally well if you know that they are going to print money. And anyway, hopefully this video has been informative. It's probably been a little bit too long, but anyway, hope everybody is having a lovely day. And any questions, please leave it in the comment section down below. And to the 4 people who keep on supporting me, I hope you're having a lovely day, and take care. Bye bye.